He served as a senior director for East Asian Affairs for the Bush administration. He's now a senior fellow and professor at Georgetown University. Well, let's start where he finished, if you're a betting man, you're betting on Mongolia?
I bet on Mongolia because, number one, holding it in either South Korea or in China has a lot of complications to it. It's making a choice between the Chinese and the South Koreans. I don't think either the United States or North Korea wants to do that. Now, if Kim comes through with enough before this summit, I think the president would go to Pyongyang. What do I mean by enough? Let's say, for example, that Kim announces that the international inspectors, the IAEA, can go in and see that the nuclear site of testing has actually been shut down. If Kim were to take some sort of bold step like that, I think Trump would consider going to Pyongyang, much as Nixon went to Beijing. I think the reason the White House is holding back is they're trying to figure out how good a deal is available. If the deal is one where real denuclearization steps are possible, I think the president would go to Pyongyang. If not, then I think he'd pick another location.
It's interesting. You obviously have watched a lot of this sort of thing. I mean, we saw Saudi Arabia. We saw his trip to Beijing.
Right.
He likes a flourish.
He does.
And
he'd probably like to go to Pyongyang.
And when I was just saying, he must be watching this and saying, I wouldn't mind something like that. Because, I mean, both you and I were watching this. Right. Very, very impressive, the pomp and ceremony going on.
And you can tell this is a moment that the whole world is watching. This is not just about Northeast Asia or just about the two Koreas. This is about the geopolitical alignments of the world and how we're going to deal with a problem that we've had since 1953. So this is in Trump's term huge. And in that sense, I think he'd want to go to Pyongyang.
Well, and you've been on the organizing of big events like this. You know how much goes into it. I mean, it goes down to the most finite, most minute, and things can still go wrong. Talk to me about watching this. What was going through your mind? Because you know all the mechanics that goes into something like this.
Well, we call it the tick-tock. And the tick-tock on a visit is terribly close coordination. Every moment of what you saw there, from the little children to the desk where they sign, is all choreographed to the nth degree. You want to make sure that every moment and every shot makes both men look historic. That's your goal. Your goal is to set up something that the world will sort of takes your breath away. And you saw it with the traditional dress of the South Korean soldiers, the flags, the red carpets, the national anthems, all of this designed to send to the world a message that this is an important occasion. And I have to give the South Koreans great credit for that choreography. I've never seen it done as well as that was done as an opening ceremony.
It's big. It's really big. It's almost like the Olympics opening ceremony big.
It is.
But doesn't that put pressure on the ending, the conclusion? It's got to be big too. And undoubtedly there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes to lay out what can we expect to be achieved?
I think there will be some sort of joint statement at the end of all of this. It's probably, frankly, already worked. Having worked on these things, I can tell you that the staffs have been up probably for the last 5 or 6 nights negotiating that document. While there may be some finishing touches today put on that document, maybe there are a couple of issues that either side is a little concerned about, and the verbiage and the language has to be perfect. But in general, they've come to a document together, and now it's just putting the finishing touches on it. But you understand that in this case, every word in that document is going to be gone over by every expert on the Korean situation. And it's going to be gone over not only in English, but in Korean, and people are going to argue about the phrasing and the words chosen to describe things. I mean, this document will be really studied very, very closely. And of course, here in Washington, The key will be the question of how the North talks about denuclearization in that document.
And I know somebody who will be looking at it word by word. It'll be you.
Yeah.
Talk to us about the role China's played in all of this.
I think that China deserves an enormous amount of credit for what we have seen here today. The reason being that until China really signed on to the maximum pressure program last November, we really weren't making much headway with the North Koreans. But once the Chinese decided that they really needed to rein in the North, and particularly after the last nuclear test, the Chinese took away the refined petroleum exports to North Korea. In fact, if you look at the statistics, the last 6 months, there have been no sales of refined petroleum to the North Koreans. That doesn't hurt the ordinary North Korean, but it does hurt the North Korean military. And I think China has very cleverly maneuvered Kim and convinced him that he's got to take a little different path. So I think the Chinese have had a very positive role in this process. I hope that continues to be the case. Obviously, they're watching this just as closely as we are here in Washington. They will want a readout from their North Korean neighbor. They'll want a readout from the South Koreans. And of course, they'll be watching to see the reaction, the tweets from President Trump, which I imagine we can expect tomorrow morning.
Let me ask you about Moon Jae-in, because he is in really kind of a tough position because he's really got to thread the needle. He's got to have these talks.
Right.
He's got to have a deliverable, but yet he still has to deal with President Xi Jinping in China, Shinzo Abe in Japan, and most importantly, of course, the U.S. president. That's not easy, is it?
It isn't. The coordination has been extensive. You will notice that the National Security Advisor of South Korea was actually here on Wednesday to see John Bolton. So he came over to make sure that at the last minute, before this meeting occurred, that the United States and South Korea were working off the same playbook. That shows you just how important it is to the South Koreans to make sure that Washington is comfortable with what they're going to do. Now, I would predict that South Korea will make some small gestures toward the North at the end of this. I think there's a good possibility that, for example, interest sections will be opened in Seoul and Pyongyang. I think there's a possibility that something will begin to happen with Kaesong. But I would think any of those moves have already been worked with the White House, so that the White House is comfortable with whatever gestures Moon decides to put up on the table at this summit.
And family reunions, you
Family reunions, of course.
That's a big piece, too,
It's a huge piece for the South Korean people.
Let me ask you one final question before we send it back to Beijing. The U.S. having a team in place, Mike Pompeo, we saw him getting on the plane going to Brussels.
Right.
There's word that Admiral Harris is going to be the ambassador to the ROK. There hasn't been one.
Right.
How important is it, because you've been there, you know, you've got to have your players in place, especially, it's a very short window to put something together for Trump and Kim Jong-un to actually sit down and talk to one another.
Absolutely, and I'm very glad to see that the Senate decided to confirm Mike Pompeo for the position, because you need a Secretary of State, you need sort of the captain of the football team, if you will, on the field. And had that not occurred before the Trump-Kim meeting, I think it would have been very hard to orchestrate this. So I think that's a good move. Obviously, Admiral Harris, very, very competent man, tremendous amount of experience on this topic, is a good choice. I hope that can move quickly through the nomination and the process on the floor of the Senate. And let's get our team out on the field, because we need it.
Dennis Wilder, thanks so much for coming in and visiting with us. Certainly appreciate it. Love your insights.
Great.